Okay, as we move in now to the motor side of the basic review here of human psychology, we're going to focus on human motor skills, right? And so we've already covered pretty much all of the related sensory stuff. And one thing to keep in mind as we talk about human movement, and this is a funny one because this type of topic, even though I'm calling this a review of basic human psychology, human motor skill doesn't necessarily pop up in very many classes in psychology, even though it is an important part of psychology, right? How we operate our bodies and control the body using the brain, of course, and some of the various performance limits. So we need to talk about a lot of this stuff, even not as a review. But what I was going to say is that in relation to the sensory topics that we've covered, a lot of the stuff related to haptics remains pretty important here for movement. And I think this relates to some of the things we talked about in that last module about things like the control of posture. And so how does a person maintain an upright posture? Well, certainly that's a movement related act, right? We have to perform a variety of different muscle contractions throughout both the legs as well as the core muscles, abdominal and back muscles both, not to mention head and neck, to maintain a posture. But of course, it relies crucially on a variety of kinesthetic, vestibular, and as we saw in the moving room studies, even visual input. And so there's an important, portmanteau here of two words, sensory and motor. So when we talk about human sensory motor functioning, that's an important concept here. And so we need to think about how sensory information is very much relevant to the control of movement. And so we did some of that, off and on throughout the sensory notes, and we need to talk in more detail now about the specifics of movement. So our first question is one that requires a question here of how fast can we move? And one way to start with this is to think about human reaction time. And certainly, of course, reaction time requires some sensory input because we can obviously think about just how fast the muscle can twitch. But typically, that response is response to a stimulus. So we have to have some visual detection of a stimulus or any stimulus. It doesn't have to be visual, but the idea is you have to have a sensory detection of a stimulus before you can do any other things in reaction to that. So we're going to now think about how to measure reaction time. And so we have to design a task for this. And so it could be a visual task, right? So there might be some visual display. And as soon as some important event occurs in a visual display, you've got to push a button as fast as you can. Of course, it could be an auditory alarm, could be anything, right? But the idea is there's some kind of stimulus. But we can add complexity to the task as well. And so we see here that there are at least these three different kinds of reaction time tasks. So the simple RT task, RT for reaction time here, is just as I've described. There is a stimulus, and as soon as you detect it, you have to respond to it. But then there's also a discrimination task. And so what is that? Well, it might be the case that in a certain situation, there might be more than one stimuli, right? So it might be that in case there is one specific stimulus, you have to respond. And if it's a different stimulus, you do nothing at all, right? So now what you have to do is that in the face of two possible stimuli, you have to discriminate between them before you decide whether or not to respond. This could be a situation like in driving, my go-to example for everything here, red light versus green light, right? If you're driving down the road and you come up on an intersection and the light is green, then you essentially don't really have to do anything except maintain your current status and keep driving through the intersection. But on the other hand, if it's a red light, that means you have to respond by hitting the brakes to slow down. So in that situation, you have to discriminate, is that a red light or green light, before you proceed with making your response or not responding. And then in other situations, you could have multiple stimuli, but you might also have to choose between multiple responses as well. And so we're going to call that our choice reaction time, because in addition to discriminating the stimuli, you also have to now choose a response. One example of this, and maybe I'll just keep it to a laboratory setting here. So this is how this research was originally done. All this stuff was invented actually in the 1800s. So what we're going to do is maybe have a light bulb flash, right? And if the light bulb flashes, you push a button, and that's a simple reaction time task. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add two light bulbs, one on the left and one on the right. And if the one on the left flashes, you push the button. If the one on the right flashes, you do nothing. So that's your discrimination test, right? So you have to first discriminate which light bulb has illuminated. Left, press the button. Right, do nothing. And now you have add another layer of complexity here. Let's give our subject two buttons. If the light bulb on the left goes on, push the button on the left. If the light bulb on the right goes on, push the button on the right. So now we have two stimuli and also two responses. So in addition to discriminating the stimuli, which light has flashed, well, I also have to now choose which of the two responses that I need to make at this point, right? So that's a really simplified kind of a laboratory contraption here that can add any number of different stimuli and also any number of different responses. But our questions are, how do these changes to the task influence the reaction time, right? To go from a simple task to now having to discriminate multiple targets or stimuli to then having to choose between multiple responses. Something else that you might have, a question that might form in your mind at this point is, when I defined the choice RT task of having the light on the left flashes and you push the button on the left, and when the light on the right flashes, you push the button on the right. What if we added another layer of complexity here where I'm going to swap the buttons? So if it's the light on the left that goes off, I have to push the button on the right. And if the light on the right goes off, I push the button on the left. I've sort of created this kind of weird mapping from stimulus to response, right? And that's also going to come up in this little section on human movement here as well. It's called stimulus response compatibility. But that's not here yet, right? But that's a little further down the line. And as a note, there's so much content here to cover in the human movement section that I've broken this out into two different PowerPoint files, and therefore there's going to be two different recordings here. So what I have defined previously as the simple reaction time task is exactly what I have defined right here on this slide here. So this was, as I mentioned, done in the original work in the 1800s by a guy named Donders. And so here is an example. The number, not necessarily 200 milliseconds as the reaction time, not necessarily exactly what Donders found, but it's a fairly typical average human reaction time to a simple task like that. And that's something to keep in mind in and of itself, right? That in simple tasks, humans are unlikely to be any faster than about 200 milliseconds, which is a fifth of a second, right? There's 1,000 milliseconds in a second, so that's 1/5, right? So that's certainly one thing to remember. Now, what happens though when we add in our extra stimuli? In this case, it's a little more complicated. I have but 5 light bulbs on our display, but there's still only just the one button. And so now there's only one of those 5 lights is designated as the target light. Maybe it's the center one, right? And you ignore any lighting of the other 4, right? What we find here is that the reaction time increases by a small amount, maybe about 75 milliseconds extra. So now our total reaction time is 275 milliseconds. And now maybe you can see why Donders refers to this as the subtractive method, because if we want to understand here, how much time does it take to discriminate between our 5 different light bulbs and our 5 different stimuli? Well, what we can do is we can take the reaction time for that task, 275 milliseconds, and subtract from it the reaction time from the simpler version of the task when there's only one stimulus. And our difference will be 75 milliseconds. And so we might try to infer here that what's happened is that the increase in total reaction time of 75 milliseconds represents the extra time taken to discriminate the stimuli. And so in this case, we might imagine that this cognitive process involved in detecting a stimulus has a stage that takes about 200 milliseconds, and then the time involved in discriminating stimuli is another stage of cognition that takes an additional 75 milliseconds to occur. And then what happens now if we add in a separate response for each of our light bulbs? Now maybe the reaction time jumps up dramatically to something like 425 milliseconds. And so in this situation, again, if I want to calculate how much time it takes to choose the response, I would take my 425 minus the previous 275, and I would have 150 milliseconds there for that, right? And so this is the idea, is that on the bottom here, we've got the math of this worked out, at least in terms of the formulas, the concept of the simple reaction time is a measure of the time it takes to just detect the stimulus and perform the response. But if we add in other layers in this cognition process, perceptual discrimination adds a little extra time to it, right? And response selection or choice adds a little extra time to this as well. And so once we start thinking about what are the factors that influence how fast you can perform a response, we're going to ask the question, well, outside of a simple reaction time situation, if you have to do any kind of stimulus discrimination, that's going to add time to your response time, right? Or if you have to choose multiple responses, that's going to add time to your reaction time as well. We might further ask questions such as, is it always the same number, right? So if I add more stimuli, does it always just add 75 milliseconds to my time? Or does the extra time depend on how many stimuli I have added? And the same goes for the choices, right? If I add more responses, is it always just a fixed increase in my reaction time? Or does the increase in reaction time depend on how many responses I have to choose from, right? And we're going to see the answer is the latter in each case, right? How many extra stimuli increases your reaction time? More stimuli, longer reaction time. There's not really, curiously, not a lot of simple, clear-cut studies on increasing the number of responses and how that maps to changes in reaction time. But as a general rule of thumb, we can say that yes, more responses means a longer reaction time. So let's look at this in a little more detail here. So what influences simple reaction time? Is that simply just a fixed thing, right? Just like it's just simply just the time it takes to have activation of the appropriate sensory organ and then transmit that activation to a relevant part of the brain and then transmit muscle contraction signals to the relevant musculature and have the muscles contract. This is all would take some sort of time. It's purely physiological, but it's still going to take some amount of time. So we might think that, well, that's the ultimate limit, right? It's just the speed with which we can transmit this information through the sensory motor neural loop. And to some extent, that might be true, right? And that might be why we can't get reaction times to get much faster than we know them to be. I mentioned 200 milliseconds, maybe if we push it 150 milliseconds, but that's pretty much pushing it in terms of the absolute fastest human reaction time we can measure. Not that we can measure, but that we've been found to exist, right? Now, it might be the case, though, that in certain situations that make the stimulus difficult to detect, there can be some concerns about reaction time here, right? So we mentioned briefly in previous notes about human thresholds, right? Sensitivity to a stimulus. And so if a stimulus is near your threshold, meaning it's just barely detectable, so it's an auditory tone maybe that you have to listen for, but it's in a noisy environment, so it makes it harder to detect it, or if it's just very, very quiet for whatever reason, and therefore you just barely notice it, it might be that you take an extra fraction of a second to think about, did I hear that? Did that really just happen, right? And so as you deliberate, did I hear something? That time it takes for you to consider whether you really detected a stimulus obviously is going to increase your reaction time. So any stimulus that has some detectability issues certainly will influence your reaction time, right? But for stimuli that are well above your threshold, conversely, typically those are simply just immediately, quickly detected, and then you can respond to them quickly. Now, something else that we want to think about here for the discrimination here is I mentioned how many stimuli are present, and this is a well-defined discovery in human movement research known as the Hick-Hyman law, right? So the increasing the number of stimuli increases your reaction time. But something else also to think about here is the discriminability between your stimuli, right? So let's say, for example, that we have our array of 5 light bulbs that we talked about in the previous Donders experiment. So there's just a horizontal alignment of 5 lights. And you have maybe instead of the middle one, maybe I want to make the second light the target. And so the question here is, how easy can I discriminate when the second light bulb is illuminated versus the first or the third, right? And it might be a little bit confusing because of the way these bulbs are laid out, and maybe they're very close together, and it might be difficult to discriminate location. But what if it's something else besides location? What if it's color, right? So what if I have these light bulbs and 4 of them are red, but 1 of them is green? So that red-green color contrast is probably going to be very strong, and it's going to be easy for me to distinguish when it's a green versus a red. But what if my target is no longer green, but maybe is more of an amber light, right? So now I have to detect an amber, which is kind of an orangey color, right, versus a red, which is not that different, right? And so it might be that there's a slight delay caused by the difficulty I have in discriminating my target versus a non-target in this situation, right? So all of the things that we've talked about in past sensory studies, like visual contrast, color contrast, visual acuity, things related to even auditory things as well. So how well can, if the stimuli are tones of different pitches, how well can a person discriminate 2 different pitches? Well, obviously, if they are drastically different from each other, like a 100 hertz tone versus a 10,000 hertz tone, right? We're looking at 2 very different frequencies here, very different pitches. But can a person discriminate a 400 hertz tone from a 410 hertz tone? Somebody might be able to do that, but not necessarily everyone, right? And also control discriminability as well. So thinking about being able to grab onto something with your hands and recognize the shape of the object with your hand, that could be a stimulus, right? Once you recognize it by touching it, can you correctly discriminate those different shapes by touch, right? And then with the choice reaction time, as I said, there wasn't really a lot that looks into the total number of choices of responses that would influence reaction time, though we can assume that having more choices will increase reaction time. But what I said earlier about stimulus response compatibility, right? The actual mapping or alignment between the stimulus and the response that you perform can sometimes be very intuitive, and sometimes it can be very confusing. And so we're going to look more at that later in the notes. But our first thing we want to do is get to the Hick-Hyman law in a little more detail. So that was previously here under discrimination reaction time, right? Adding more distracting stimuli, right? So I'm going to have 1 target stimulus, but many other stimuli that I simply just have to ignore. So this was 2 different studies performed by 2 different people here, Hick and Hyman. They kind of came up with the same idea separately, so we give them both name here, the name of the law here. But they were both kind of working in the early 1950s on based on the recent discoveries in information theory. So in the late 1940s, Claude Shannon proposed information theory in a way to calculate information and information entropy. And so here we're going to talk about, we can calculate and quantify information using a unit called a bit, which is a contraction of the term a binary digit. And maybe we can explain, we'll see if that comes up. Otherwise, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. The formula is here, right? H for bits is the base 2 logarithm of n, where n represents some number of equally likely outcomes, right? So in this case, we can use coin flipping as a very simple example, because when you flip a coin, there's only two possible outcomes, right? It's going to land heads or tails. And so since that's the case, we take the base 2 logarithm of 2, and you can do this on a calculator to confirm. It will tell you that the answer is 1. And so we would say that you've gained 1 bit of information by having observed the outcome here. And so what we see here is that the amount of information gained is also then equally proportional to the amount of uncertainty you had before you see the outcome. So when you flip the coin, you can ask, what will it be, heads or tails? But I don't know yet. So I have some level of uncertainty that's proportional to how many outcomes there are. And therefore, once I observe the outcome, I've eliminated that uncertainty by observing which specific outcome. And therefore, I have gained some quantifiable amount of information, 1 bit of information, right? So that's a simple case. Now let's back it up actually and think about this for a second. What if the coin is a cheat, right? So it's heads on both sides. Or it's weighted in a way that makes it land heads every time. And I know it's a cheat. So that way, when I flip the coin and I say, what's going to happen? Well, I know the answer, right? I know it's going to land heads because it's only a head coin, right? So I have no uncertainty. And so there's only one possible outcome, which means no uncertainty, right? And you can also check that the base 2 logarithm of 1 equals 0. So I have gained no information when I observe my cheat coin land heads, because I knew that was going to happen. And of course, we can go up from there, though, right? So if you're rolling dice, a 6-sided die, well, there you go. You're going to have a base 2 logarithm of 6. I don't know what that is off the top of my head, but it's going to be more than 1 bit of information, right? So this idea that we can start quantifying information, and then psychologists, cognitive psychologists in particular, really like this idea of saying that, well, can we think of the brain as something like a computer processor that has to detect information from the environment, and that's the input. So in a classic kind of computer processing environment, we think about input, processor, output, right? Input goes into the computer processor, it performs computations on that, and then it determines an output, and that would be now the response. So the stimulus in this case for your reaction time task is some amount of input, right? And then given that input, I have to perform some information processing on it, and then I have to determine my output, right? So in this case, the idea is that if I start increasing the amount of input, that increases the information processing that I have to have, although it doesn't change my output necessarily, right? Or at least output complexity, right? I still either respond or don't. And that just depends on the result of my information processing that I have performed. You know, was that the target that has signaled, or was it a distractor, non-target that has been signaled, right? So this is the idea here that by increasing the total number of distracting stimuli in a task like this, in the discrimination reaction time task, this increases the amount of information that I have to process. And that means that it takes a little more time. And so this is where we also want to talk about bandwidth, because bandwidth is essentially related to how much information can I process in a given amount of time. And that means we can describe that in terms of how many bits per second can I handle, right? So information has to pass through this system, and the system can only handle a certain number of bits per second, right? So by increasing the amount of information flowing into the system, we might slow that system down because it needs a few extra seconds to process all of that extra information, right? So this seems to suggest then that not only can we calculate how much information the system can hold on to, maybe if it was a memory system, but we can also calculate how much information the system can transmit. We can measure its bandwidth. All right, there we go. So here we have the results of what Hick and Hyman separately discovered here, is that when they think of it this way, we do the choice reaction time task where we're going to increase the number of targets, and that's going to be the n in our calculation of bits, right? So h equals the base 2 logarithm of n, where n is the total number of alternative stimuli as labeled on this graph here, right? And as what we find is that on the graph on the left, as we just keep increasing n, on the x-axis, the reaction time increases on the y-axis, but notice it has this curve, right? But that's a logarithmic curve. And this is where that base 2 logarithm turns out to be very useful, because when we take the base 2 logarithm of the x-axis, which is what we see on the right-hand graph, then what we see is that those curves turn into straight lines, right? And that helps us understand that, yeah, the logarithm is actually very important here in terms of measuring the information. And that's how that's labeled on that other graph there. It's labeled as information transmission measured in bits, and reaction time on the y-axis. And so what we're seeing here is that this was an experiment where they did lots of different kinds of stimuli. Some of them were lights, some of them were numbers, some were other things. So the idea there is, with sometimes you might have different stimuli that give different slopes and intercepts with these linear functions here. And that's what I have at the top, is that the reaction time is a linear function with a slope of b and an intercept of y of that information variable of the log 2 of n, right? Now, so that's the Hick-Hyman law, but what about the choice task, where now I have to choose many different responses? And I had mentioned before that this is a stimulus response compatibility issue, right? What's the mapping like? So in the case that I mentioned before, when the light on the left goes off, you push the left button, and when the light on the right goes off, you push the right button. That's a fairly simple, straightforward mapping. But if I cross the responses so that the light on the left means push the button on the right, and the light on the right means push the button on the left, got my words mixed up. That was a stimulus response compatibility too, right? Then again, that kind of crossing of the stimulus to the response confuses things a little bit, and can increase reaction time. So we need to think about how visual displays map onto response arrays, right? Control arrays, right? So here's an old iPod, right? Pretty old, but the idea here is that if you've ever used one of these, right, what you're looking at on the screen on the left there, we see an album by Nelly Furtado highlighted there in the center, this is like a rotating array of album covers, right? So if we want, or in this case, it would be specific song titles, I guess. But so the idea is that if you want to play that song, you would hit the center of there's a little scroll wheel as your control. And that circular wheel, you can actually, I don't know if you can see my finger here, but you can roll your thumb around in different directions. And there's a center button that you can push as well. And so if you want to select that song, you can push the center button, it'll select it, right? But on the other hand, if you want to keep scrolling to other albums, you have to roll your thumb in this kind of circular trajectory. And that seems to make sense, because what happens is that the way those album covers move is that they kind of spin past you like they're rotating on a big horizontal carousel, right? Now, that's all well and good, except one thing to note is the rotation involved here is that the rotating wheel is vertically aligned, whereas the rotating carousel of album covers is horizontally aligned. So when I do a clockwise rotation, where do I expect that to take me? Do I expect that if I wanted to not listen to Nelly Furtado, do I do a clockwise rotation to spin her off to the right to see that album cover to the left there, the yellow and black? I can't quite make out what that is, right? Or do I do counterclockwise because I want to look at the other albums over to the right there? And so that might be the mapping here, but the question is exactly what is the mapping? Here's another MP3 player. Is that a Zune? I'm not quite sure. It might be a Microsoft product. But in this case, it's a similar kind of issue. There's a big kind of semicircular button in the center here. And you can do the same kind of thing. You can kind of spin around the outside of it and press it up and down and sideways and so forth. But what we have is now a horizontally aligned menu of choices, right? So how do my control actions here map to changes in what I have selected and highlighted on the screen? Here we have much older fashioned, but more classical, everyday kind of situations for control display mappings. Stovetops, right? So if we look at that stovetop on the top there, which is a pretty old one, we see that we have 4 burners that we might want to turn on, but we also notice that we have 6 dials across the top back of the stove panel, plus some other indicators on the right. So which one do I, if I want to turn on that bottom right, which is probably the one you use the most, right? It's close to you and it's the big, strong burner. Which knob controls that? Is it the one on the far right? I think it's the 4th one from the left, right? But that's not necessarily obvious just by looking at it from here, right? And that mapping is a little bit odd, not to mention, of course, the safety concerns of having those buttons on the back panel of the stove. And that means you might have to reach over a hot pan to turn on or off the stovetop burner there. What if it's boiling over? What if it's on fire, right? Then it's going to be a lot harder to reach around over there. Now here we see a newer stove that puts the control knobs to the front, right? You don't have to reach over anything. And now they have maybe a different kind of spatial alignment that roughly corresponds to the spatial alignment of our 4 burners here. More examples of a variety of different layouts that have been sort of just studied and tested to see, you know, what might be more intuitive if you were to present people with these different combinations and have them perform various tasks, or to just judge which ones they think make the most sense. You can kind of get a sense of all of these different possible organizations and which ones would work and which ones would not work. Now, to look at the more carefully controlled research in this topic, we want to go back to the 1950s again. So Hick-Hyman law comes out in around 1950 or so. Now Fitz and Seeger are coming in 1953 with this study of stimulus response compatibility here. So what we have here are, this is a little tricky and weird looking image here. So on the left, on the top of that left image, there's labeled SA, SB, and SC. The S here stands for our stimulus panel, right? So I have stimulus panel A, which is a circular arrangement of lights, right? So that's it, right? So we've got 8 different lights there that could light up. Now, stimulus panel B is more of a rectangular / diamond-shaped pattern of 4 lights. And stimulus panel C has the same 4 lights actually as stimulus panel B, but we've separated them out into 2 displays. So I've got my horizontal alignment on the left and then a vertical alignment on the right. So it's like I've separated out and abstracted out those two dimensions of panel B into 2 separate dimensions here. So now on the bottom, I have response panel A, response panel B, and response panel C. And now this is something much more like a, it says here, it's a metal stylus on the circular baton in the center of a response panel. So what we're really thinking about here is something like a joystick. And I'll see if I can use my pen, although the zoom camera is not working well. So you have a stylus that you can then move back and forth to and in front of you like this, right? You can also move it left to right, sideways. But you might also be able to move it diagonally in different directions. So this is working a little like a joystick, right? So when you have stimulus panel A, and then you also pair that with response panel A, so that means if the top light goes on, the 12 o'clock location, essentially, you move your joystick forward, right? If the 6 o'clock light goes off on the bottom, you move your stick backwards, right? If the 1 o'clock light goes off, then you move the stick diagonally up away from you to the right. So there's a very clear-cut mapping between the response and the light bulb that goes off, right? That radial array of lights closely aligns to the radial array of the joystick positions, right? And the same goes for stimulus panel B and response panel B, right? I can move forward and backward, and I can also move left and right. I can move in a whole rectangular array, actually, but mostly moving forward and backward and left and right is all that I really need. And then in response panel C, we have 2 controls, right? One that can go front and back, and the other that can go left and right. So you maybe do a 2-handed kind of movement here. So we can mix and match these though, right? So what happens if I want to use response panel A for stimulus panel B? Well, that's not so difficult, right? Because now it just essentially eliminates the 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and 10 o'clock light bulbs here, essentially. And I can still move my response panel A forward and backward for the 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, or left and right for the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock lights, right? And the same goes for pairing stimulus panel C with response A, right? But what about trying to pair response panel B with stimulus A? So again, if it's the 12 o'clock location, that's pretty straightforward. I go push my joystick forward. But what if it's the 10 o'clock light that goes off in this case, right? There's no direct way to get there, but what I could do is I could push the joystick forward and then move it to the left to get to that corner, right? Or I could go left first to the 9 o'clock and then move forward and then get to the 10 or 11 o'clock kind of corner there, right? So there's a way to perform response B to SA, but it's obviously now a little bit a stranger, more ambiguous mapping. And the same applies to response panel C, right? So response panel C can handle stimulus A, right? What it would mean is that when it's the 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock, I just use the front and back side of response panel C, right? And when it's the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock locations, then again, I just use the left-hand side of response panel C to move left and right. But what if I end up with the 10 o'clock position illuminated? Well, here's what I have to do. I have to move the left side to the 9 o'clock position, and then I have to move the right side to the 12 o'clock position. And that combination of left and up together means going to the top left corner, right? Or if I go right and up, that means going to the 1 or 2 o'clock position on the spiral array, right? So there is a way to achieve a mapping from SA to RC, but it becomes slightly more complicated, right? And what they found is that by pairing the different stimulus sets with the response sets on the right, what we see here are the reaction time numbers. That's the top bar here. Is that right? Yeah, time in seconds is that particular bar. And then there's an error rate, and then how much information was lost, right? So it's simply suggesting that when you complicate the complexity of the mapping, there's some degree of information load that's occurring here that causes a loss of information, right? But we'll focus on reaction time, right? Look at the mapping from SA to RA gives us 0.39, but when we pair SA to RB, we end up with a reaction time of 0.43. And then for SA to RC, the reaction time goes up to 0.58. So we see just this continuous reaction time increase there, right? And then conversely, when SB pairs with RB, we have the fastest reaction time for that stimulus at 0.41. The RA gives us 0.45. The RC gives us 0.58. And then again, when SC and RC are aligned, we have the fastest reaction time for that stimulus at 0.48. RB gives us 0.58 and RA gives us 0.77, right? So that one doesn't work very well at all for that particular stimulus. So we see then that, again, this alignment of the response to the stimulus is very important. It definitely affects your reaction time. So that seems to suggest that we can do a lot to explain the speed of a human response, right? But there's something else we need to think about here, which is that reaction time studies are somewhat simplistic, because all that they really do is they might focus on a very simple response that involves activating a button that your finger is already resting on, for example, or just flipping a switch, again, that your finger is already resting on. And that's kind of similar to what the Fitz and Seeger study was just doing, right? You have your hand on this joystick and you just got to flip it forward or backwards, right? But in many other kinds of motor tasks, we may have to reach a long distance, right? There might be a whole big control panel in front of us and our arms are down at our sides, and I have to reach out and hit a button, right? Or flip a switch or turn a knob. And so there's any number of different kinds of controls that I have to operate, and I have to reach for them. And so the time it takes for me to just initiate the movement, which is to begin my reach, that's reaction time. But then we have to think about the time it takes for my hand to actually get to where I'm going, right? And so this is now what we might call the travel time. After the reaction time, which is the initial impulse that gets my hand moving, my hand has to travel to the control and then and then grab onto it, select it, and start performing this action of turning, pushing, flipping, whatever it might be. So there's much more of a physical or motor component to this task at this point. And so what we're going to see here is another kind of very well-cited phenomenon in human movement, really in human cognition in general, called the speed accuracy trade-off. So if I am reaching for something with my hand, the faster my hand is traveling, the less accurate I'm likely to be, right? It causes increased variability in my movement endpoints, right? And that's true in a motor response. It's true just in general, like in human cognition, right? If you're doing your homework and you rush through it, the idea is that there's increased likelihood that you may make a mistake, right? So just this idea that doing things too quickly tends to cause us to make mistakes raises the question of information processing all over again, right? It seems to suggest that, again, the human cognitive system may have some type of a bandwidth issue, can only process a certain number of bits per second. And if I increase the total number of bits of the task, you would expect it to take longer to perform it. But conversely, if I'm trying to rush, which means I'm trying to limit the time component, then that means there's going to be a limit to how much information can be processed in that short amount of time. And if I end up not processing all the information, this is where we talk about information loss, right? And with information loss means error at this point. So that's kind of what they were getting at in the Fitts and Seeger graph, although I didn't really get into the details of it, but we can see a little bit more when we look at our next phenomenon. Well, my coffee got cold. So just as a reminder, the base 2 logarithm of n is our way of calculating bits of a task. And we're just assuming here that we're going to have a cognitive system that processes information measurable in bits and maybe has a fixed bandwidth of being able to process a certain number of bits per second. And that's sometimes also referred to as channel capacity. A channel processes information, right? And so now we're going to have our speed accuracy trade-off research. And this is, again, the work of Paul Fitts. Paul Fitts gave us the Fitts list in the automation notes. He gave us the Fitts and Seeger study, and now we're going to get Fitts 1954 studying the speed accuracy trade-off in what's called a pointing task, right? So you're simply just pointing to a target, and what we're going to do is we're going to increase the information difficulty of this pointing task, and therefore increase the amount of bits that need to be processed. And what we want to do is we want to measure how long does it take you to perform this task, given that we know how many bits are involved in the task. So we start with this key observation, right? We know that if I increase the accuracy demands of a task, that causes people to slow down, right? And that would seem to suggest that the accuracy demand somehow relates to the informational content of the task, right? That increasing the accuracy demand increases the amount of bits that you have to process, right? So what we want to figure out here is what are the factors that actually directly go into the determination of how many bits need to be processed in a pointing task. And clearly accuracy constraints are relevant here. And what's accuracy, right? Accuracy relates to the spatial constraints that you have on your movement. So when it's a really tiny button that you have to press, then clearly you have a high accuracy demand because you're not allowed to wiggle one way or another, right? You have to be very precise and very specific with your movement. So we're going to call that target size, or as Fitts did, target width, because he's dealing with rectangular targets. And so he's concerned just about the width of these targets. You'll see why in my image coming up here. But as it turns out, there's another factor that also influences the time it takes to perform a movement, which is the movement distance itself. This is what Fitts referred to as amplitude, movement amplitude or target amplitude, which is the distance between the targets. And that makes a little bit of sense too, because obviously our hands don't travel at instantaneous, speed of light speeds here, but rather there's a fixed degree of speed that we can achieve with our muscle contractions as well. But as noted, of course, as I increase the speed of my movement by stronger muscle contractions, that adds variability to the movement output. It's a simple proportion, a power law kind of a thing, really, where the amount of endpoint variability is a direct function of the magnitude of the force applied to the muscle contraction. So we don't want to have too much variability in our movement, because then, of course, by having a larger force output to the muscle adds variation to the movement, and that then increases my error. And if I have to make sure I'm keeping my error as small as possible, then of course I want to slow it down, right? So here's the task that Fitz did. And again, he's got a stylus, a metal stylus that people are holding. It looks like a pen, right? But it's got wires on it here that are attached to an electrical loop circuit. So that way what's happening is that those dark strips are really copper strips that every time you touch down on it, it activates a timer that records the time. And the subject's task here is to go back and forth between those two rectangular dark strips. See if you can see me here like this, right? As fast as possible while still ensuring accuracy. And that instruction is critical, right? As fast as you possibly can, but still ensuring that you're accurate. Because if a person's just going wildly as fast as possible and they miss the targets, they clearly were not measuring their bandwidth, right? Because they're not processing information if they're blatantly missing the target every time, just because they're going, as fast as they can literally make their muscles go. So we want to ensure accuracy, but if someone goes so super slow that they are ensuring accuracy, but they're not being pushed to their upper limits, then we're not really measuring the limit of their abilities, right? We're just measuring the fact that, yes, you can hit this target, but I want to know what's the fastest you can go and still ensure that you're going to hit the target. And that's a measure of the upper limit of your information processing abilities here, right? To go as fast as you possibly and can, but still hit the targets. And so, we can talk about defining here the target amplitude, as I said before, as the distance between the targets. So how far do you have to go? And so we would easily imagine here that as I start to increase the distance between the targets, it's going to take a little longer to complete these pointing movements, but also the width of the targets. So these little black rectangular strips are partially covered by these sliding occluders, sliding doors here. So that way I can make them narrow, right? I can make it a tiny little narrow strip, which obviously then decreases our target width, or I can open those sliders up all the way and make that a much wider, easier to hit target, right? And this is what Fitz did, is he combined different combinations here, right? Different values of the distance or amplitude between the targets, as well as comet variations in the size of the target itself, right? So what we find here is what we would expect, that distance increases movement time, and decreasing width also increases movement time. So that's important here because we see that the relationship between target width or size and movement time is inverse, right? Decreases in target size, increase movement time, right? So one goes down, the other goes up. That's an inverse relationship. So that means that since increasing distance, D increases movement time, that's not an inverse relationship. That's a regular, monotonic relationship. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to make a ratio, a fraction, with D in the numerator and W in the denominator. And that's going to help now capture the effect of the constraints here, right? The distance and width constraints, and it's the ratio between them that turns out to be very important. So if we assume now that ratio D over W is the actual constraint on the movement that determines how much uncertainty there is and how many bits of information have to be processed, then we can sub that in for the value in our original formula for our bits, right? So instead of the base 2 logarithm of n, we're going to do the base 2 logarithm of the D over W ratio, right? And that's going to be how we determine our the bit load of this pointing task, right? Is what particular D over W ratio are we dealing with here? Now, a small thing to point out here is that when we do this, it turns out to be 2D over W instead, right? So where do we get that? Well, one possible explanation, there's different possible explanations, but one way to think about it is that if I'm aiming for the center of the target that has a width W, that means the actual amount of clearance I have on either side of the center is only half of the target width, right? So the proper value to put in the denominator is not W, but W over 2. And so that would give us a ratio of D over W over 2. And simplifying that gives us 2D over W. That's one way to think about why we are dealing with 2D over W here. So we're going to call this 2D over W here the index of difficulty, right? So again, the N in the original formula for calculating bits was meant to be a measure of uncertainty. And it's the uncertainty that determines the difficulty of the task and how much information you have to process. What do I mean by uncertainty here? Where does uncertainty come into the picture for reaching to point to a target? Well, the question you might be thinking here is that our ability to reach and point for a target, like you see I'm doing here, I'm going to point at something on screen, right? That's a feedback loop, essentially, right? And what I have to do is I have to, as my hand is traveling to a target, I need to be able to ensure that my hand is traveling correctly to the target. You know, it's on the right trajectory and I'm not deviating some way and making a mistake. And so the further I am away from the target, and that comes with increasing distance, the more uncertainty I have. And as I get closer and closer and closer to the target, the more certain I'm getting that I'm on the right path. But that means, of course, that over this course of approaching the target from a longer distance, I have to process more information because I have to eliminate all of that extra uncertainty as I get more certain the closer I get. The same goes for the target width, right? So my ability to evaluate the accuracy of my movement trajectory is pretty easy when the target is large, because I know that even small wiggles in my movement will not affect my accuracy. But when the target's very small, now I have to be concerned over those small wiggles. And in that situation, again, there's some increase in my uncertainty here. So we can see then that increasing the distance you are from the target and decreasing the size of the target increase your uncertainty about whether the movement that you're performing will be accurate. And you have to slow down to affect that accuracy, to eliminate that uncertainty, right? And process all this information. So here we're just seeing another depiction of the Fitts law task. In this case, it would just be pointing to a circular target, right? The idea is that we can either increase the amplitude to make the task more difficult, or I can decrease the target width to make the task more difficult. And so we see that there are different combinations. But one thing that's important here is that we see in one situation here, from the top, we see that we have one combination of A1 over W1. But if I double the amplitude, so now I have A2 over W1, I get a result of 4, as 4 bits in that task. But I can also keep A1 constant and halve the W, so I end up with an A1 over W2 ratio, which is also 4. So this is kind of an interesting thing that would predict that in these two tasks, A and B, doubling the amplitude or halving the width have the same effect on the index of difficulty. And we might expect then, now the question is does the index of difficulty predict movement time? And if that's the case, then I would expect that, yes, the movement time to those two tasks ought to be the same because they have the same index of difficulty of 4, right? In fact, this is exactly what Fitts found. So when Fitts is doing this study of pointing back and forth between our rectangular strips as fast as possible, but still ensuring accuracy, and he records the time it takes to complete this movement. What he finds is that, again, the relationship between our index of difficulty which is our 2D over W ratio, the bits of the task, linearly relates to movement time with a slope B and intercept A. And when you calculate a linear regression like this, you can calculate the correlation coefficient, but also commonly we calculate R square, which is a measure of the variance accounted for by the function, right? By the regression itself and the variables that go into the x-axis. The R square is 0.96. That's crazy, right? In psychology, we don't see this kind of super high R square, which that's effectively telling us then that we've essentially accounted for all of the variation in movement time just by accounting for that information of difficulty like that, right? We don't need to pull in any other variables here. We've done a sufficiently good job, right? We also can even calculate the actual bandwidth of this as well. It's related to the slope of the function. And so we can calculate a bandwidth of 8.2 bits per second from Fitts's data, although this depends a little bit because it's one thing to use a stylus like he's doing to tap on targets. One thing that Fitts did in the original study is he used 2 different styli, one small and lightweight and another one that was really heavy. And obviously the heavier one had longer movement time. So you could say that maybe you have a slower bandwidth there, or lower bandwidth, sorry. But when you do this task applies, as I'm pointing out over here on the right, to computer pointing tasks, like using a mouse to click and point on, to point and click, sorry, on any kind of icon on a screen, right? And so it turns out this is a useful piece of information, because if I want to determine what's the best kind of cursor control device, right? You can imagine all kinds of alternatives to a standard mouse. And you may have seen some of these before, like roller balls and track balls and track pads and the little isometric joystick, the little eraser head type thing that would stick up in the middle of a laptop keyboard. If you remember those, I don't think they are made anymore. And so you can actually do a Fitts law task comparing these different devices against each other and look at their slopes. And whichever one has the highest bandwidth, right, allows you to process the most bits per second, which would actually be the shallow slopes in the situation. Then you would think that that's the superior device, right? So it's an interesting way to do that. So, but what I'm just showing here, the reason we call it Fitts law is two reasons. One is that this is a lawful mathematical function in which we've accounted for essentially all practical variation in the data, but it also holds up across a variety of different tasks, right? So the original Fitts task, the person is repeatedly tapping back and forth between those two targets, and that's called the reciprocal tapping task. But what if they just do it one time? And that's called a discrete movement, right? So you just move and point one time, and that could be a simple point and click task like on a computer. So it still applies to that situation. People have tested it with people using a small little pointer viewed under a microscope. Fitts law still holds up there. It works underwater. It works regardless of whether you're pointing with your hands or if you're tapping with your toes, or even using a pointer attached to your nose, like a laser pointer attached to your nose, it still works, right? And so what we see is that even though Fitts law holds to be true across all these different tasks, what differs across the task is the slope of the function and therefore the bandwidth of that system. And so we want to see what's the most efficient way of controlling a pointing task. We can measure that. So here's the actual data from one of Fitts's experiments, right? So we see that with the index of difficulty on the x-axis and movement time on the y-axis, we just get this really tight linear function, right? All the points are very close to the line. So we have a very high R-square, like 0.96. And we have the actual slope and intercept values there, but what's called IP is the index of performance, and that's defined as the ratio of index over ID over MT, right? And think about that, right? ID is measured in bits and MT is measured in seconds. So IP itself has units of bits per second. There's another equivalent function I said was related to the slope, and that's called 1 over B. What the inverse of the slope is called throughput. And so in that case, as I said, a shallow slope would mean that you have a high throughput, right? And a higher index of performance. So this research has been done, right? What we can do is we can think about, well, how do we want to compare computer pointing devices? And so this is a pretty old study by now, Card, English, and Burr, compared a trackball with a joystick versus cursor keys, right? You can use buttons on the keyboard to control a cursor as well as a mouse. They found that the mouse was superior. And in all of the 40-some years since then, 45, 46 years by this point, right? There's been all kinds of alternative cursor control devices invented, and none of them have beaten the mouse when it comes to performance on a Fitts task, at least. And certainly, of course, this influences larger and broader design considerations. So when we are putting controls in an array somewhere, such as on a car dash display with controls that have to be operated, or an airplane cockpit, what we want to do is we want to factor in the need for rapidity and accuracy, right? Anything where accuracy is critical, I want to put that close to our user and large. And anything where rapidity may be critical, again, close and large. And of course, it even helps us understand some things such as the layout of a screen. Like when I'm building software, if I'm building a web browser and I want to have selectable icons in the window somewhere, where do I put them, and how big should they be, and how far off to the sides should they be? Well, that certainly depends on things such as the frequency of their use and how much accuracy and rapidity is required in a given task. And certainly we're going to, want to think about that and take that into account. Something else to think about here is called control display gain or ratio. So when you use the mouse and you move the mouse cursor around on screen, there is a particular mapping between the rate of your movement of the device itself versus the rate of movement of the cursor or pointer as it appears on the screen. And that's called the control display ratio. So you might move 1 inch of your mouse across the tabletop, but does the pointer travel 1 inch across the screen? If it did, we would say there's a 1-to-1 ratio there, right? 1 inch of the control movement equals 1 inch of display movement, right? That's why it's called that. As it turns out, that's not really a very effective mapping, right? So let's take a look at this right here. So that's what that means is control display ratio is actually kind of the inverse of gain. Gain is defined here as display displacement or cursor displacement divided by controller displacement, right? So if it was 1 inch of controller displacement led to 1 inch of cursor displacement, that's a 1-to-1 mapping, right? And we'd have a gain of 1. Well, maybe that's not very useful, right? So let's think about it. We have now the possibility of having some very large computer displays, right? And if your computer display is, maybe looking at mine over here on the right, I'm on a double display that you can't see obviously, but it's pretty big. It's at least horizontally, I'd say 20 inches wide. So that would mean that if I had a computer a gain setting that was 1-to-1 like that, I would need to move my mouse 20 inches horizontally across the tabletop here, and that would be ridiculous, obviously, right? So we can ramp up the gain clearly, right? And I can set it to say something like 4 inches of cursor movement are gained for every 1 inch of controller movement, right? So now I have a gain of 4 because every inch of movement is 4 inches on the display. So in this case, if I have a 20-inch horizontal dimension that I want to travel, I only need to move my mouse 5 inches on the tabletop instead of 20 inches, right? Because I'm dividing by 4 at this point, because that's what my gain setting is to. Well, that's not so bad, right? Now I can use a small 5x5 mouse pad to keep my mouse on, and I don't have to worry about ever exceeding the limits of my mouse pad here, or having to make long swooping movements with my mouse. Or even worse, what's called clutching, where I have to move the mouse a couple of inches and then lift it up and go back. If you've done this before, we have to lift up the mouse and kind of move it over and over again in the same region. Not very desirable. But it turns out there's a possible downside to ramping up the gain to these really large values like that, right? So the advantage is that I can travel a long distance across the screen with even the tiniest little movement of the mouse. But what happens when I want to point and click on some tiny little target that might be only, let's say, 1/8 of an inch wide? Right. So in this case now, in order to appropriately make the small, high precision movement that cause the cursor to travel into that small 1/8 of an inch wide target, I need to move the mouse 1/4 that distance, right? What's the fourth of an eighth? I don't know. It's like 1/64th, I guess, right? That would be a tiny little mouse movement, and that's going to be pretty challenging, I guess, at this point. To make these tiny little mouse movements to get my cursor into tiny targets. So we see that there's really a trade-off here. When I want to travel a long distance across the screen, I want a high gain. But when I want to point and click on a tiny target, I want a low gain. So that's weird, right? Because can we have both at the same time? Well, we can in a way, right? So this is where we have what we're going to talk about here as positional gain, in which the gain remains constant all the time. And that's not necessarily ideal, because it's going to give us this problem of exactly what I was just talking about. If I want to think about which gain is best for a typical GUI, computer graphical user interface. In this case, then what's going to happen is what I've said before, right? So I've got a different example here of a 28-inch, sorry, large display. So in this case, if I have that one-to-one gain mapping, I have to travel with my mouse across my desktop 28 inches across the table, right? When I change it to gain, set the gain to 4, now I only need to move the mouse 7 inches across the table here on my mouse pad surface in order to get my pointer all the way across the screen. But in this other situation, and here's the actual math on this, right? With a gain of 4, and I want to hit a target that's 1/4 of an inch wide, now I have to be able to make small movements on the order of a 1/16 of an inch, right? So this is going to make these small movements difficult, right? I could do the opposite though, right? What if I went for low gain, right? If I went for a very low gain, then that would mean I can make a really large movement with my mouse and the cursor would only travel a small distance, which might be useful for getting those small targets. But it's not so good for making the large movement across the screen. By the way, if you've ever used a microscope, you've used these kinds of high gain and low gain controllers, right? Because when you are doing the initial focusing, you use the high gain knob, right, which creates a large change in the focal length of your lens. But then in order to do some very fine-tuned adjustments, there's a different knob that makes very, very small. You can make large rotations with this knob, but it only results in very, very small changes in the focal state of your lens, right? Because that's a low gains kind of situation here, right? I can make a large change with my controller, but the thing that I'm controlling only responds weakly to it, right? That's low gain, and that's what happens with the two different kinds of scales of control, focusing control on a microscope. But what we can also do, though, is instead of positional gain that I've been describing, where there's sort of just like this constant fixed proportional relationship between control displacement and display displacement, we can also set up what's called a velocity gain situation here, where now the amount of displacement of my mouse is not really depending on the amount of the amount of displacement of my cursor or pointer on screen is not strictly a function of the amount of displacement of the mouse, but it's about the velocity of the mouse displacement, right? So what we're going to see here is that when you have a high velocity mouse movement, it increases the gain and your cursor will travel far across the screen, even with just a small 1 or 2 inch movement of the mouse. But because you did a high velocity mouse movement, it caused an acceleration in the cursor that travels far distance across the screen. But when you slow down and you're doing a small, low velocity movement of your mouse, then the gain drops accordingly because it's based on that mapping of the velocity of the mouse to the acceleration of the cursor. So in this case now, what's happening is it adjusts to a lower gain and it's easier to control for small, high precision movements. So this kind of gives us this advantage, as I'm mentioning here, that with this kind of variable gain type setting like this, you're able to use a small footprint on your table, on your desk, to be able to still operate a cursor across a large display, but you can still also acquire small targets. All right, well, that wraps up the first part of our motor control and human movement content.